Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining today's webinar. Before I introduce our presenters, I want to go through a few housekeeping notes. First, questions can be submitted through the Q&A tool, not the chat box, the Q&A tool. Icons located on the bottom of your screen. We'll do our best to answer all the questions, but if we run out of time, we will follow up individually or in some other format with our responses. I got to do the legal disclaimer that the provision and receipt of information in this presentation is not legal advice, does not create a lawyer-client relationship, and should not be acted upon without seeking professional counsel who have been informed of the specific facts. We're going to have 4 presenters today. All are active in our higher education practice. 2 of us are active in our labor and employment practice. We have Christina Riggs. Christina is Vice Chair of Saul Ewing's higher ed practice. In this role, she partners with higher ed clients in their day-to-day operations, providing advice on student affairs issues, campus safety, Clery Act, FERPA, federal discrimination laws, Title IX, and many other matters. She's currently the lead higher education representative on the firm's COVID-19 task force. In this role, Christina is actively tracking COVID-19 and CARES Act related guidance impacting the higher ed industry. Catherine Beaumont Murphy advises educational institutions, including independent K-12 schools, colleges, and universities on legal and risk management matters. Prior to joining the firm, she was in-house counsel and compliance manager for an independent K-12 school. Her work there included counseling senior administrators as well as the board of directors on issues affecting the day-to-day and long-term management of the school. She advises on student employee issues. She helped create new internal policies on intellectual property and study abroad, and worked on Title IX related issues and investigations. In her private practice, she has a wide range of experience advising colleges, university schools, and other nonprofits. Carolyn Pellegrini is in our higher ed and our labor and employment practice. She assists employers with labor and employment issues and other sensitive matters affecting their professional relationships with their employees. Colleges and universities in particular rely on Carolyn for representation in litigation and advice on day-to-day operations involving HR issues and their compliance with federal and state laws. And I may not look like it, but I've been advising colleges and universities since I joined the UVA Legal Counsel's Office as a law clerk in 1982 during law school. I started out as a labor and employment lawyer with a small boutique, developed a national practice involving ADA Section 504 and fair housing. My recent higher education work is centered on disabilities law. And of course, since late February, all of us have spent significant time, sometimes most of our time, and in some cases countless webinars, as you have, dealing with COVID-19 issues. So our goal today is to help you to develop your plan and your playbook. Some of these issues are complicated, and today we'll only be able to help you identify the issues, some of which are going to require a deeper dive. We're going to talk a lot about contingency planning. Whatever plans you make, you're probably going to need to revise and adapt to conditions. We're all dealing with a lot of uncertainty about COVID-19 and the economy, about the virus, about many things that we just don't know, and that uncertainty is going to continue for some time. You're going to need to plan for different scenarios, be flexible and resilient. In the short term, the biggest factor we're going to be dealing with is fear. Fear of students, parents, employees, contractors, those who you invite on your campus. Some of it just fearful about leaving the house, and some of it legitimate fear for those who are more vulnerable. And fear will continue among all stakeholders when, not if, students and staff and faculty are exposed or become sick. Most of us have been advising clients the last 2 months who remain physically open as either essential or permitted by local order, including constructions, restaurants, first responders, medicals, and others. And here's a couple key lessons that we've learned, and some of you probably have too. First, if you're going to promise something, if you say you're going to do something for your students, for your employees, you better have the capacity and the procedures to make certain you do it. You need to be able to keep your promises. Second, when you tell your employees, all your employees, including the faculty who don't think they're employees, that they must follow certain rules, your supervisors need to enforce those rules. Doesn't matter whether it's hand washing or social distancing. If your supervisors don't enforce it, people will be watching, students and other employees. And third, if anyone raises concerns about safety or employees who don't want to come in for safety reasons, please act very cautiously. Juries and agencies that investigate retaliation claims and discrimination claims are going to be very sympathetic to employees over safety concerns. I just received our first, what I think is our firm's first employment discrimination and retaliation charge yesterday over COVID-19 safety complaints. So with that, I'll hand you on over to Christina.
Thank you, Rob, for that introduction. So we're going to dive right in. If we could advance 2 slides. As Rob said, today's presentation is all about preparation. One more slide, please. We recognize that this is unpredictable, right? We're dealing with a rapidly evolving pandemic, and that has and will peak at different times in different states, in different locations, and it will impact each institution differently. What we know today could change tomorrow. It could change in an hour. That type of rapid evolution could paralyze a group into thinking that they don't have enough information to prepare. If you walk away with one thing today, the idea is that you do need to prepare. You need that plan to be flexible, but you do need to prepare, because there are going to be a number of areas on your campus that need to not only make sure that you're permitted to open, but that you have the capacity to open. So if we look at what your fall semester could look like, and let me be clear, when we say open in the course of this presentation today, what we're talking about is the return to some physical presence on campus. So that's what we mean when we say open for today's presentation. And that might be full, that might be partial. Here are just a series of ways that colleges have already or are in the process of deciding to handle their fall semester. Could operate virtually for the first part of the fall term, but there is a possibility that you will have to, that you could return to campus sometime in the middle. You could have the flip side. You could choose to start in person, but because of an uptick in your area, you might have to return to an online environment sometime mid-semester, much as we all had to do back in March. You could decide we are going to operate in a hybrid manner, having both options for in-person and online, perhaps class dependent, or you could just choose to operate online for the entire fall term. But at some point, either in the fall term or the spring term or thereafter, schools will need to decide how they're going to operate safely in an in-person environment. And so when you're making that decision, it's important to look at this in 2 ways, and that's what we're going to do today. The 2 ways are really, are you permitted to open? And then are you prepared to open? So if we go to the next slide, the first question really should be, are you permitted to open? All right, this is going to be guided by a number of factors. The first are the governmental orders. And I say governmental orders broadly, right? Yes, of course, we have the executive orders. We also have state orders, and we also have local orders, right? So you need to make sure you know what you're permitted to do in your particular environment. Are you even permitted to open, and in what way, shape, or manner are you permitted to open? It, though, is very important to also make sure that you have someone on your campus or someone's on your campus that are tracking the public health information, right? This is nationally from the CDC, from the WHO, from the NIH, but it also will be guided from your local hospitals, from your local folks that are telling you what the public health issues are in your environment, and what capacity your local facilities will have if you are actually bringing people back into your area. And then only after those 2 do you really get to the point of your stakeholders, right? What is right for your community, your students, your employees? And it's those things that all come together to decide first if you're even permitted to open or if it's the right course of action. Then you go to the question of, are we prepared to open? And that's what we're going to spend a lot of time talking about today. So on the next slide, what we're going to be doing is walking you through 6 service areas. These are areas that likely impact most schools. Not all schools have housing or some of the other components, but most schools are going to be dealing with these areas. It's important to recognize that when you're looking at these are some of the biggest things that define the student experience, that define the employee experience, and that define your campus. So you need to make sure that you have contingency plans for all of these areas to make sure that not only can you, but can you safely open these areas. Now, I've highlighted in bold the COVID-19 response. Before we get into the 6 service areas, we did think it was important to give you the big picture, to help you understand how to set the framework for each of your goals within these areas. So at this point, I'm going to turn it back over to Rob to kind of walk us through the big picture of our general COVID-19 response.
Next slide, please. So the big picture. No, none of us can say anymore that this is unforeseen and it's unforeseeable. The world is different. It's going to be different. What does it mean that it's not unforeseen? Well, now you have to have a plan. You have some idea of how this pandemic is going to work and how it's going to vary and how things change day to day. You're going to have to deal with this pandemic, and I hate to say it. While you're doing that, you need to consider planning for the next one or the next contingency. And there are certain steps you got to put in place on your campus, and that means you probably need to change your policies and your procedures and do all the associated training while still figuring out how to do all the myriad of other compliance issues that you have just in your day-to-day operations. We won't even get into Title IX regs and how you do things virtually and those inconsistencies. We won't touch it. But it's adapting policies and procedures to a varied new world and dealing, and until there's a vaccine and antibodies and herd immunity, which is going to be sometime down the road. And it's all dependent on the state. Look at what's happening in California, just within the state and the variations. And many of you will have different approaches, all depending on your stakeholders and your regions. That's the big picture. Next slide. So here are the 5 areas, big picture, you need to, that we're going to go into shortly here. You need to have experts. You need to designate individuals who have expertise. Creating the process, planning for positive tests. It's easy to get down in the specifics, but you need to start with what is your overall goal? Is it to bring the people back? Is safety the primary concern? Is it to maximize revenue? Well, these are all overlapping and sometimes competing interests. And this is really about the risk tolerance of your president, the board, and the administration, and frankly, other stakeholders, including parents, and your own economic capacity. What you have the capacity to do, what you need to do to keep open versus what are the risks and what's your tolerance when things start getting, when people start getting sick. Policies and procedures are going to guide you. That's going to be your roadmap or your playbook. You can't know everything, which is why you're going to need to designate issues to become experts in their areas. No one can keep track of all of the changing guidance on a daily basis, what the government is doing, what others are. And when your policies and procedures aren't right, you need to kick out the chain of command. Every one of your schools has an emergency response team, whatever it's called, a crisis management team for business interruption, for cyber, for different kinds of challenges. You have that team already in place. Are they the right people to manage this crisis, this pandemic, and to manage it over the long term for the entire 2021 school year and possibly beyond? Next slide. When we talk about experts, we're talking about not experts in the virus. We're talking experts on how managing exposure and dealing with the effects and the related areas apply to each department. In many cases, this is going to be the VP or provost, but they're going to be busy on a lot of other management issues. Who is going to be sort of the in-house designee who will coordinate this? There is no COVID coordinator in academics or housing yet, but you may need a designated responsible person. You will need to know, where do people go when they're a question? And one of those areas that is often seen at the bottom of the list and is now at the top, your first responders, maintenance, facility, custodial, campus police, all of those folks who are going to be responsible for implementing all of those cleaning plans and maintenance and other issues that you set up here. Next slide. If you thought keeping on track of regulatory issues was fun, well, just keeping track of the changes that are going to affect you day in and day out. CDC has been providing its guidance regularly. WHO goes in. You've got all of these different players, And then depending on the area, you have specific administrative bodies, whether it's the NCAA or OCR on issues related to compliance in a pandemic. You're going to have lots of different pieces that will govern different areas. And you need to decide, is this in the legal counsel's office or drilled down to the individual areas who are supposed to be keeping track of the various, governance issues that you need to respond to. Next slide. We talked about the workflow for delegation down from your crisis management team to the departments, the reporting structures, and how to create it back up. So as we discussed, there really may need to be discussion groups or teams within each of these individual areas, but there should be an overarching coordinating body that is meeting regularly on this issue, whether that is the president's current crisis management team or some other ad hoc body that you create to manage this across the very issues. Because what you will find as we go through here is that while there are issues unique to each individual area and what you need to think about, there are also themes that overlap. The employment issues overlap everything else because how the workers interact and the employee rules for each of the areas are going to be somewhat similar. So you do need to have that coordinating body on these issues. Next slide. The slide says plan for positive tests. You got to plan for people to be sick. It may be a localized outbreak where the numbers tick up in your community. It may be the day that everybody comes back and you first test and you have positive tests because you have testing capability, and suddenly students arriving on campus who are asymptomatic and now they're sick. You're going to have employees who are going to get sick and others who are exposed. It's inevitable in a large open campus, no matter how many people you have, and if they're interacting in their communities and not just staying at home. We saw this in every industry that was open even a little bit. And some people will get sick. And then both how you do it and your communications plan and what your position is as people become sick or, God forbid, die of the virus. All of this is something that you have to be prepared for how you are going to deal with, and your plan should anticipate that it will happen, and you need to be responsive to try to do your best to keep things safe. But at the same time, if you're going to close the first time that anybody gets ill, then you got to wonder whether you're really prepared to reopen. So all of these issues on the first level, you may be dealing with just localized concerns, different requirements, changing your protocols, worrying about social distancing and masks and taking precautions. But your contingency plan includes widespread outbreaks within the school or in the general community where suddenly you're back in stay-at-home restrictions as we were in March, and how do we restructure them in mid-semester. One other thing on this issue, when you talk about all of this, you're looking at testing. You'll need to decide whether or not testing is going to be mandatory. That's a legal question if the applicable organization requires it. It's a supply question if you want to. What tests, are they reliable? Are you going to require it? Are you going to do contract tracing on your own? In many cases, you can't because of privacy reasons, employee situations, you won't be able to. So that needs to be coordinated with the state if you have a positive test. State or local health departments are going to provide guidelines. You need to follow them. Some are mandatory, others are going to be suggested. And then you got logistics issues. If you want to put masks, what kind of masks? Who are you going to turn to? Are you going to give better masks to your supervisors than your employees? That was one of the issues in this charge I got yesterday. And then you have to think about the OSHA issues and reporting and safety when you do have positive tests. And of course, the workers' comp issues. Next slide. Final issue in all of these communication issues are the privacy issues, the HIPAA issues, the FERPA issues, media access, and I will add for the employees the ADA 504 confidentiality requirements for most employees. So depending on the situation and the seriousness, you may be able to disclose FERPA as you have been able to do for other issues and emergencies. You've had this with violent students with various diseases in the past. Same rules apply here. HIPAA may apply in some situations depending on how you get the information, often will not. ADA 504 is going to apply to most employee issues. Some employers who open right now have been criticized for not telling everybody as soon as somebody tested positive, identifying and outing that person, or telling the entire business that somebody was positive or sick or ill. Well, you're caught between federal government requirements on privacy and your ability to provide a safe workplace. And those are not easy issues to navigate. So all of those issues and the privacy issues need to be at the backdrop for all of this. Next slide. So to sum all this up, you have a wide range of policies and regulations that you're going to have to think about how they need to be managed, how they need to be adapted in this environment. And this is just a list, and we're going to be going into a number of these as we go along in the specific areas. All right, Catherine and Carolyn, turn it over to you.
Great. As Rob gave us a great big picture, and as we know, one of the ways to start to put those big pictures into action and to start to take steps to manage all these big issues is a good place to start is to look at what your policies and procedures are already and the regulations you're going to start to have to look at. We are going to come back and touch on these over and over the course of this presentation, but we wanted to give you a checklist from sort of the student side and the employee and business policy side of some of the things to start looking for. On the student side, and I'll just go down this checklist relatively quickly, the first three check boxes, of course, we bring up because we are aware of the class action lawsuits that have been brought against universities in the wake of the spring pandemic. So you want to go back and take a look at your contracts in these areas. Schools have been wondering if their enrollment or tuition agreements need to change to include specific mention of the virus, or whether there needs to be language about what may constitute instruction for purposes of tuition payments or expectations of students. Along these lines, do you want students to assume the risk of returning to campus and or release the school from claims? You want to think about the enforceability of such agreements as well as the optics of such agreements. What about your housing policy? Does it say that students pay for the entire year, whether or not they are using the housing? And along those lines, do your housing agreements and your dining agreements and your student fee agreements, do you even have agreements that cover your student fees? Do these agreements have a statement about what happens to those fees to the extent that the university can't perform its end of the bargain? Us lawyers know that as the force majeure clause. Again, obviously we bring this up because of all the class action suits we're seeing. The other policies to think about are how you can get students to comply with all of the measures we're going to talk about today. What happens if you try to enforce social distancing or masks? You may want to tie those requirements to your conduct policy. You want to make sure that the students understand your protocols for sickness. If they feel like they're having symptoms, they need to report them. And they also need to understand that if someone in their sphere is sick or if they have known contact, it may impact their experience on campus, either in the way that learning is distributed to them, or they may need to self-isolate. One way to think about this, again, this is an option, a tool. Instead of pouring through every policy is to create an interim policy that references the areas we just spoke about. Who knows, as Rob alluded to earlier, how long this is going to last, but that may be a good way to get your initial thoughts down. And finally, as it relates to students, we have regulations on this slide. Be aware, and we're going to come back and speak about these a little bit more in depth, but be aware of the regulations that affect student life, including the Title IV distance learning regulations, the ICE regulations for the Student Exchange Visitor Program, which we'll talk about later, and of course the new Title IX regulations, which we won't talk about in depth because we're still reading through all 2,000 pages of them, but they also will still need to be enforced, even if you're in a virtual environment.
Thanks, Catherine. There are also a number of employee and business policies that you're going to have to take a look at and determine whether they need to be either updated in whole or, as Catherine said, updated in the interim as an interim policy. You know, oftentimes we encounter employees who, when we ask them to do something, they say, well, where is that written down? Where does it say that I have to do that? You want to be prepared for those questions and say, it's in this policy that I provided to you. And the other thing we're going to talk a lot about is training. When we start changing policies or we start putting interim policies in place, are we training people about what they say? Everyone knows someone who has signed an employee handbook without reading it. As people start coming back to campus and we start putting these new policies in place, that's certainly something that we don't want to have happen. We want to make sure that people are aware of what's in those policies. We want to make sure that people know that the attendance policy has been updated, that their ability to use paid time off might have been changed, that the FFCRA leave is available to them for qualifying circumstances. And one of the things that we'll touch on is discipline, that people can actually be held accountable for not following policies such as face coverings and masks and social distancing. So again, this is a laundry list of things, but it's certainly something that we have to be thinking about in order to prepare ourselves to come back to campus in some way, shape, or form. I'm going to hand it off to, I think, back to Catherine. Awesome.
Yeah. So next slide, please. So now we are going to get into our major categories. Are we prepared to return to campus? And if you'll advance to the next slide, you see we're going to start with academics, because the next slide, please, you'll see that this is what you do. It's teaching and learning. We hope to show you that there are options for how to approach this, as Christina mentioned at the beginning. It'll be a hybrid between in-person and online. Fully online, partially in person, and you'll have to toggle between these. So we hope to give you some tools, some things to think about, to be flexible if you've got to move between the three, which it appears more and more likely every day that you will have to do. So on the next slide, we're going to show how we're going to think about this in stages. First, your curriculum, then the spaces in which you'll teach, the employees who will be teaching and taking care of those spaces, and finally, again, some COVID-specific policies and procedures that can help guide you in the area of academics and curriculum. So first, on the next slide, we'll talk about designing the curriculum. I think the first thing to think about, and again, we'll come back to this, is that you may need to repopulate your campus in stages. Which populations need to be on campus the most? And to that end, if you have to de-densify the campus, a word I like, I don't know if it's a real word, de-densify the campus, who would be the first to leave in that situation? So depending on your campus, your particular programming, what about the lab sciences? What about the freshman experience? What about signature programs? Those are the programs you may decide will be accommodated first in an on-campus situation. Vulnerable populations may be the last to be accommodated. These people can self-select potentially, and then you'll rewind that if there's an outbreak and you've got to toggle back towards that hybrid way of learning. So this brings us to the next checkpoint. There's a number of reasons why you may need this hybrid experience. For example, if you've got capacity constraints, you may need to do online instruction for those who are remaining at home, or if someone gets sick, that individual may need to be at home. So we're talking about segments of the population learning the same thing at home, like, you know, maybe English majors. You can see on my books behind me. They may be, you know, the people who learn at home first. But it also may be just one person learning at home for various reasons, while the rest of their cohorts are in a classroom. I'm not going to expand so much on what online pedagogy means, just that you need to think about it. There are experts who are studying that right now. But how might that happen? And we've given you some checklists here to think about. This could be department by department plans for these fluid transitions, but also department by department plans for making these individual student accommodations that we just talked about. For example, if your plan includes wearing masks, what about students with breathing issues who can't wear masks? Or what about students who need to lip read? Have your departments think about these issues as they're coming up with their plans. Again, what about a student who may need to be at home while others are in person, whether because of capacity or because they're sick, or maybe because they just don't feel comfortable coming? Will your hybrid plan include video recordings for these people? What about grades for people who can't come to campus? We know that students are very concerned about grades, and there's been a lot of discussion about what grades will look like after this spring's pandemic. And for schools who have a lot of clinic and internship programs, which I think a lot of schools do, because the experiential education component has become so much a part of higher education, which of these are going to fall into that top checkbox as being essential? It's important to really think about the ways you're going to let students know that these are voluntary. And to that end, you'll want to review any individual and site agreements you have with your clinic and internship sites. On the next slide, we'll talk about, again, how you're going to design this curriculum. So what if you can come back and then there's a localized campus outbreak? First of all, as you well know by now, you'll need to put CDC and local health department rules into place, which could include expanded social distancing, which could include you've got to take a segment of the population off camp and back home. So how to plan for the very real possibility that there'll be the hybrid we talked about in the last slide. And so some of these are a repeat of the last slide, but these items should be and could be on your checklist for every stage. What about disability accommodations? The other accommodations we talked about. What about a laptop policy? I don't know if your school issues a laptop to everybody, but to make this a possibility, you may have to rethink that and do that. And again, have university-wide plans, department by department plans, and training. We talked about this, maybe a tabletop run through for the department. And then finally, virtual plans, what we experienced this spring. Pandemic conditions, it's all virtual. This is the time to codify everything you learned this spring, again, into university-wide plans or department plans. And think about, as you're doing this, how your technology held up during this. What do you need to upgrade? What do you need to change? You know, referring back to the laptop policy, but also your internal technology infrastructure and the team who's in charge of it. Maybe that needs to be bolstered as you plan for a partially, if not fully, online return to campus. On the next slide, we will now move into thinking about the spaces where these classes will be held to the extent that they are partially held back on campus. I think we're all thinking about this. Which classrooms are going to best allow for social distancing? Large lecture halls and auditoriums may need to hold classes for fewer amounts of people than you'd normally see in a large lecture hall. Where else could you do it? Be creative. What about the gym? What about the art museum? I saw an article recently that one college is going to use its campus for the purposes of classes. Do you need to get more space? What's that going to look like? Maybe trailers, is that too small? Are there spaces in your community, in your town that could work? And I think, you know, what we're coming to the realization is that our idea of, you're familiar with the Harkness table, that square or round table that's crammed into a little basement alcove, and you've got students crammed around it discussing ideas. We may have to let that go for the fall and really think about what we are going to do within these spaces, which brings me to the next checkbox. What are your social distancing protocols? We're going to keep coming back to this. Do you sit 5 chairs apart? If you don't, do you wear masks? We may be used to classes filing in while the previous classes are filing out, and crowded hallways. We may need to allow for more time between classes for proper cleaning protocols. Can you get big classrooms clean, big auditoriums, big lecture halls in time before the next class? As always, accommodations and accessibility are important, particularly if you are using buildings that aren't intended to be classrooms or don't normally have students coming in and out, and so may not have the breadth of accessibility you would need. What about one-way flow? One stairway goes up, one stairway goes down. How does that work with your disability accommodations? All things to keep on your checklist. And then finally, how will you handle less traditional classroom spaces? Laboratories, it's hard to take everything you need in a laboratory and move it to a larger space. So perhaps PPE, personal protective equipment, will now become a de rigueur part of lab equipment. And then areas like theater and dance, which It's going to take a little more creative thinking about how you can still, or art programs, how you can still have those classes, if they're a really significant part of your programming, in a way that's safe. So let's move to the next slide, and we're going to talk about how employees fit into these plans.
Thanks, Catherine. So in addition to thinking about the spaces that you would like to open and the spaces that can facilitate these sorts of interesting learning opportunities that we have here, we also have to think about who prepares those spaces. You know, custodial has to go in and get those spaces ready. You know, is there some sort of maintenance that needs to be done to that facility before it can really house these sorts of learning environments? When you start thinking about the space, think about who's actually going to go into that space besides just the students. You're also going to have faculty that's going to have to go in and out of these spaces. You're going to have the support staff for that faculty that are going to have to go in and out of these spaces. So in addition to the student population, there's also a specific employee population that is going to go with each physical space that you're looking to open. And you are going to have to make some determinations about how essential those people are, how essential the functions are, and how many people are we going to be able to have in and out of these spaces on a regular basis while maintaining the level of cleaning and protection that we want to. The other thing that you have to think about when you start thinking about your employees is, what are the fears and hesitations these people are going to have? Not only are we having to think about parents who are very concerned about their students going back into spaces where people are crammed into small buildings together, you know, dorm rooms, that sort of thing. There are also employees who are coming back to work. You know, there might be just the general fear of, I don't want to get sick and I don't want to get other people around me sick. Just a general fear that I think everyone in the country has. But then we also have high-risk individuals. We had spoken previously about accommodation questions. How do we accommodate the individuals who have a pre-existing condition, who have family members who have a pre-existing condition, and say, I don't want to come into work because I might potentially expose my family member when I go home. Also think about the employees who have childcare issues. There's been a lot of robust conversation about reopening childcare facilities. And particularly with this new inflammatory syndrome that we're seeing in children, childcare facilities are going to probably be more hesitant to open now. So what are we going to do about the employees that we really need to come back to prepare these spaces, but might have a myriad of issues going on at home that we really need to consider and try to accommodate in bringing them back? Go to the next slide, please. So once we do get people back into the space to prepare it for learning, for academics, how are we going to make people as comfortable and protected as we can once they come back? So for faculty members, you know, faculty is used to having office hours. It's Monday, Wednesday, Friday from 11 to 3 or whatever the case may be. Are we going to get all of our faculty members together and say, look, we need to start rotating office hours. Everybody can't have the same office hours. That's too many people in and out of the hallway at once. There's just too much exposure. You know, is it that this office the professor in this office can have office hours and then 2 doors down, another professor can have office hours? How are we spacing people appropriately with that? Classroom scheduling, you know, Catherine talked about what sorts of spaces are we using? How are we going to open different areas of the campus to facilitate academics that wouldn't normally be open to facilitating academics? How are we scheduling things? Are we having enough time in between classes for people to get in and get out? When it comes to employees, particularly faculty, if someone's using a microphone to speak to their class, is that a microphone that's specific to them? Or do they take it with them? Or does it have to get cleaned before the next person? These are all things that we really have to be thinking about when bringing these people back. How many people can we allow to work from home, right? So some of the support staff, they have been working very effectively from home. Some may not. Do we continue to allow people to work from home? Do we have some sort of rotating schedule for them? When it comes to the custodial folks and the maintenance folks, how are we scheduling them in a way that they can get in and out of the building, potentially with encountering the fewest number of people possible? How are we going to do that? And then, you know, the very basic, what kind of additional physical safety measures do we have in place? How frequently are we deep cleaning these spaces? How can we train some of our custodial staff to become deep cleaners? Are we providing face masks? Are we expecting people to bring them on their own? And then sanitation stations, you know, doorknobs, handrails. Are we putting those sorts of things in place so that not just students, but employees also feel comfortable about coming back into these spaces to do their jobs? I'm going to kick it back to Catherine.
So I'm just going to wrap up, if we can move to the next slide, talking about our academic focus on this by, again, coming back to policies and procedures, because you know, as attorneys, we love those. And again, you're going to hear some repeats, but we're just trying to, as we said, give you an overview and keep giving you options. We talked about policies that pertain to academics, enrollment and tuition. Do they specifically or implicitly accommodate virtual environment? Technology use policy. I think this is really important, particularly if you're going to be expecting students to use technology for the majority of their classwork. Your conduct policy, as we mentioned, this could be in your student handbook. It could be elsewhere, but if you need students to abide by the stipulations you put in place for them to come back on campus, you've got to be able to enforce it. We've talked about department by department, sort of a micro way to make this happen. What do departments say about attendance, about credits, about requirements? Do these differ between departments, and are they going to be different in an online environment? What other policies are unique to your school? Think about those as they pertain to academics and to the learning that's going on. A couple more things to talk about as they apply to academics. If you go into a distance learning requirement, as you may know, federal Title IV funding is tied to a higher education institution's compliance with the requirements of each state in which its enrolled students are taking courses, as well as a number of other requirements. Because of the pandemic, these regulations were relaxed for now until June 30th. So in short, right now, schools don't have to seek the approval from the department. They normally have to seek to provide a breadth of online learning. New regulations are scheduled to go into effect on July 1st, and there's no indication yet that either these new regulations will be extended or whether these relaxed regulations will be extended as well. So keep an eye on that as you think about coming back in the fall and preparing for doing it online to a degree. And then finally, this last checkbox, you're going to want to make sure that everyone at the university, including the academic side and the faculty, understands the university's response to a symptomatic student or employee, so there's no question as it would affect the teaching and learning that goes on. So that's a lot for academics. We're going to move on to housing, which is just as jam-packed with issues.
Catherine, if I can interrupt for just a second.
Yes.
First, administratively, I want to remind everybody that the Q&A is open. If you type them in the corner under the Q&A sections, we may be able to type a response as we go along, or it may be appropriate for a live response while we're on that topic. So please feel welcome to use that. Also make an observation that when it comes to physical spacing and lecture classes, anything lecture, a number of you may be familiar with not only the brand new study about how long droplets last in space, up to 8 minutes, but all of those folks looking at choral and choir, church choirs and everything else about the distance that you can breathe when you're running or singing or talking loud. And what does that mean for where your professors go and where your students are going to sit? You know, all of these fun things in this setup that you need to think about in addition to 6 feet separation. All right.
All right, so if we can advance to the next slide. Housing, and one more. So you see we're coming down the list. All right, so talking about physical separation. That is difficult when we talk about housing, right? So you could jump right to the con of housing. The concept of congregated housing obviously increases the risk. The problem is there are a lot of pros to housing, right? Of course, from a financial standpoint, there is a pro to the institution, of course. But for the student standpoint, there is a heavy amount of connectiveness, integration that students feel when they are part of the housing environment. And in a way, we're basically talking about their engagement. Housing is not just a place for them to live. For many students, it is their community. It is a place where they find themselves better connected even to their academic studies. There are social environments. And so it is a big part of the experience. So you wonder then, how can we make housing part of our return to campus? And if we can return, in what fashion, and how many of our students can come back? Do we focus on those students that don't have a suitable place to reside in? Do we focus on the freshmen to foster that freshman experience that Catherine had mentioned? These are going to be some of the considerations, because the thought of having every one of your housing facilities open is probably not feasible to start. You probably are going to have to do this in a phased approach. So if we can go to the next slide, we are going to break this one down as well. Now, this might sound repetitive to the first slide when we talked about academics, and that is intentional. Everything that we're talking about today and everything in our world right now can feel very overwhelming. And so what we're trying to do with each of these subcategories is break it down into 4 very easy stages so that it helps compartmentalize your approach, which hopefully will bring some clarity. So you'll see some very clean thematic views. You want to identify spaces, reconfigure for safety, think about your employees, and then take the COVID overlay, right? So you're going to see that as we go throughout, and that's intentional. We are going to get into the first identification of housing options, but a word of caution. Part of what I'm going to be talking about is which housing options will we reopen? And Catherine and Carolyn were talking about which academic spaces will we be using. One thing that you want to think about is what are the spaces that we are not using, right? You want to make sure that your facilities folks, and I'm certain that they do, have a plan in place to make sure that they are still going to be checking in on those facilities, be it housing or otherwise, that we're not using. When a facility does not have a flow of traffic through it and does not have people checking in on it, that is where risky things can happen. Water leaks, infestation, broken window, airflow changes, and all of those things can actually create safety hazards. And so while we are talking about the identification of the spaces that you will be using, you probably want to make sure that you're continuing your security checkpoints as you are now for the facilities that you will not be using. All right, so let's switch to the next slide and go down our first identification of the housing options. So when you're looking at this, you want to think about all of your various housing options, right? Your mainstream dorms, traditional dorms that you have. You might also have apartments and suites, and I'm going to put an asterisk in that because those are really good options that you want to think about if you are planning to have a quarantine or an isolation space on campus, because many of those will have the ability to have private bathrooms, which will be important. You want to think about other housing options, right? A lot of sorority and fraternity houses are off campus and perhaps not in your control. That said, some of them are, and you want to think about how those are going to be used and if they're going to be permitted to be used. And what other housing arrangements do you have? Then you want to take a look at each of them. And the things you want to be looking for are how many rooms are within each? How close are those rooms together? If we filled those rooms with at least one student, right? Because you want to think about now taking your triples and your doubles and moving them down to one student. How many individuals would be using the bathroom on that hall? If we don't have the capacity, and most likely do not, to have individual bathrooms for every student, you need to think about how many students would be occupying that bathroom and how do we control that? Does each student have their individual shower stall? Do we have times when students go in and out? Some of that is practical and some of it might not be, but it is something you want to think about. How often will those bathrooms be cleaned? Will students be reminded about placing things on the sinks, right? You want to make sure that you're thinking about all of these things. You want to make sure also ventilation systems. So there are there is guidance out there about rechecking ventilation systems in each of your buildings, housing options, and certainly congregated housing. You want to be very clear about this. The increased airflow can assist in some ways. And so you want to think about the ventilation systems, the air condition, the control, temperature checks, all of that. And then back to who gets to go into the housing, right? You're probably not going to be able to bring everyone back. The same capacity that you had is just not going to be feasible because of the physical distance that we're going to need to maintain. So which student populations will be permitted to reside in the housing? Another thing you want to think about though is traditionally people come and visit their friends in housings. This could be either staff have people visit or students have people visit. Will that be permitted or will non-residents not be allowed? And then if you have students come back, move-in day, right? I think we can all, it's been a long time, but think back to our move-in day, right? It was a jam-packed mess of people all around in a wonderful way. That is not going to be feasible. So what you want to think about, I know that some schools that had a little bit more time to prepare for the exit that we saw back in March, we're scheduling move-out time, set up a virtual system, give everyone an assigned time, allow for the option of them to change their time so it's less manpower on your end, but that way everyone knows when they can get in and when they're going to be permitted, so you minimize the flow of people and allow for that physical distancing. So then once we've identified the housing options that we think we're going to use, we're going to switch over to the next slide to talk about how we're going to reconfigure those. So how are we going to reconfigure our common areas? This is really hard because, as I said, part of the housing experience is the connectiveness that we feel to our fellow students that are living in the house with us or living in the dorm with us, right? So your physical space, you want to think about removing the chairs, right? How many chairs are at a particular table? What is the spacing distance perhaps between a table and a couch? You want to think about reconfiguring the common area in a way that promotes use but doesn't necessarily promote congregation, which is unfortunate, but it's the world we're in. If you have a ping pong table in there, you might want to rethink about that, right? Because of the close proximity. A foosball table, right? Any of those games that traditionally bring people together, they're all touch points. And those are things that we might not be thinking about now, but we want to make sure we address them. Are you going to require students to wear facial coverings if they are in the common space? And if you are, how are you going to enforce that? Both Carolyn and Catherine had touched on this, which is very important. If you're going to mandate these things, you want to make sure that you found a way to enforce it. It could be through your conduct policy, or given that we hope this is not a forever way of living, that this is a temporary component of our lives, it could be through an interim policy. But it is something that you want to make sure is enforced by the staff that's in the building, because it will be very important. You also want to think about other safety measures, right? Do you have sanitation available? It would probably be a good idea to have informational signs posted up around the common area. You don't need to recreate these on your own. The CDC has a number of them. They just remind everyone about good hygiene, sort of out of sight, out of mind sometimes. It's not a bad idea to just remind people about washing your hands, don't touch your face, all of these things that we've been hearing for months now. And then, of course, mandated cleaning, right? And I'm sure Carolyn will get to that in terms of the cleaning staff to bring it through. The other thing I want to talk about, though, is ingress and egress. So Catherine touched a little bit on this when we talk about hallways, right? So another thing you want to think about with your buildings is how many exits and entries do we have? And will we allow students to both come in and out of the same door, or are we going to reconfigure it? And are there accessibility issues with doing that? So you want to, when you're thinking about that, Think about if there is a safe way to control high traffic areas, all right? Also, stairwells. Should there be a one direction up, one direction down? Same with elevators, right? Elevators, you want to probably minimize the capacity of individuals that are permitted to be inside the elevator at any one given time, given the size of an elevator, because there's just going to be no option for 6 feet of distance between the folks. And so you do want to have a difference on your capacity now for your elevators. One other thing is fire safety plans, right? Traditionally, we have everyone exit the building and congregate in one area. You really want to think about that. How are we going to handle our fire safety plans, and where are we going to ask students to go when they exit the building, and how remind them of how far away they need to be from each other. So that's just another thing to be thinking about. But in addition to all of these, think about these safety measures, which is, we're just, keep telling you one more thing to add to your plate, is the student experience. There are ways to engage, and we're seeing it right in our everyday lives right now, finding ways to virtually have the students engage, right? I've seen talks of sort of coffee and informational talks. Everyone gets on their computer, and instead of going to the common room, they all get on and maybe talk. Virtual games, right? A quizzo night, a speaker. These sound probably minor right now in the wake of the seriousness of what we're talking about, but when you have students on campus and wanting them to feel like they're getting the actual college experience, having those promotional student experiences virtually could be a way of making the student feel as though while this is different, they're still engaged with their friends and with their community. So,
Christina, we've had two people asking the same versions of the same question, which is, if we decide to put a single person per room, should we be charging them single room prices versus the double or triple? And while nobody has asked this one yet, somebody out there has got to be thinking, and maybe you're going to cover this later, why don't we avoid all this problem and just get everybody to sign off assumption of risk waivers and tell kids who want to live in the dorms, just, take your chances. I don't know if we're going to cover that later.
Yeah, all good questions. In terms of the rate that you charge, I mean, that's a school's individual option. Obviously, as I said, there is a revenue component here for schools, and we saw a lot of schools suffer from that in giving refunds to their students, which was wonderful. But of course, it was a financial hit to a lot of the schools. The safety measures, having those students distanced, and so that they're not having to wear facial coverings inside their own room. Sure, having a student in a single room would be the safest option. So it's a risk reduction, and it's a risk assessment that you need to take. If you want to charge them for more, you just need to make sure that that's acceptable in the vicinity that you're in, and the PR component of that. In terms of the the assumption of the risk, again, it goes back to the same point, which is it's a PR issue. You want to think about if that's the appropriate thing that you want to be messaging to your students. You certainly could. You want to think about the enforceability of it, though. Obviously, housing is it's an optional thing for most students, right? But there are many students that they really have housing insecurity, and so they really don't have anywhere else to go. And so these are the things you want to be thinking about when you're making that determination as a school. And it will be based really on your own individual school. So you want to make sure that you speak directly about your own environment with counsel in thinking about how to frame that assumption of the risk and whether or not it's appropriate for the population of student that you have as you go through that. So I think we're going to go to the next slide, and I'm going to turn it back over to Carolyn to talk through on the employee side of the house.
Thanks, Christina. So much like the academic side, when we start thinking about the buildings that we're going to open and the facilities that are going to be available, again, who are the employees that go with these facilities? Not just custodial staff and maintenance people, but we also oftentimes have desk security, particularly in urban areas. There is a significant number of security people who are working there. We also have the hall directors. I know RAs are not technically employees under particular laws, but I think you have to be thinking about how you're going to be handling those people. You know, do you need to have more RAs because you need to be a little bit more diligent about making sure that people are following the social distancing and mask rules? Do you need to have fewer RAs because there are fewer people in the dorms? Those are the sorts of things you have to be thinking about. And then, you know, is additional training warranted? Of course, additional training is going to be warranted. We talked earlier about all of the new or interim policies and procedures that you're going to need to put in place. And you can't expect your employees to be able to understand and enforce them unless you are training them on those policies and procedures. So what workers are needed to prepare housing accommodations, getting buildings ready for people to come back? Those are going to be your facilities and maintenance people. I know that there are many schools who have already brought back facilities and maintenance personnel to start getting dorm rooms ready. Summer is traditionally a time where a lot of work gets done in dorms because it's the only time that the dorms are empty, and that makes sense. But how is it that these people are going to come in the safest way and feel most comfortable getting their jobs done? The other thing to think about is contractors. You know, particularly large jobs, large construction jobs at universities are done by outside construction companies. Are those contractors putting their own policies and procedures in place? Are those contract employees having interaction with your employees? Does that make anyone else feel uncomfortable? How much assurance do you have that what you're doing to protect your employees are the same things that the contractor is doing to protect their employees? What kind of safety measures are we going to put in place? Masks, gloves, coveralls, testing. I mean, we're going to keep talking about testing, and that's always going to come back to, is a test available? Are we able to get our hands on a test? Are we able to get our hands on a test that's accurate? I think that's a huge question right now. And then for the folks that are coming back, what are their work schedules look like? So if we need multiple people to be in the same place at the same time, are we going to assign teams so that you limit the number of people that you're exposed to over time? Or are you going to have people separated by dorm rooms? One person goes in and does the electrical work, they come out. The next person goes in and does the painting, they come out. How are we going to very practically get these things done? How are we going to get the buildings ready for people to come and live in them? Creating staggered shifts, you know, to the extent that you can do that, that's also a great way. I know, Rob, you talked about how long the droplets are staying in the air. To the extent that we can keep people out of rooms, especially people who are doing things like painting, which you exert yourself, you're breathing a lot. There are a lot of droplets in the air from that. How long can we keep a room off limits until work is gonna have to be done on that room to get it ready? Those are all things that we have got to be thinking about when we're bringing people in to get these dorms ready for housing. Go ahead and go to the next slide. So then once the dorms are ready, or the living facilities, however we make that work, who is going to need to be there once they come back, right? We talked about the RAs, the security people, if you have people at a front desk, that sort of thing. Facilities and maintenance are going to be in and out of those places constantly. Custodial is going to be in and out constantly. We're going to need extra shifts for sanitization. As much as, you know, dorms can be really gross, you have a lot of people living there together, they're all kind of an age where they're not necessarily the cleanest people they're ever going to be in their lives. We're going to have to clean that even more frequently than we've been cleaning it regularly. So how are we going to keep employees from having to come into contact with every student that comes in and out of that bathroom in the dorm? Are we going to require that students be away from the dorms during a certain time of day so that that cleaning can be done with the least amount of interaction between employees and students? For small maintenance issues, replacing a light bulb, something like that, is there a way that we can get our maintenance people to just get on some sort of basic video chat to help students out with those very basic things? And even if we can, what kind of liability does that bring up? If we have a student who's replacing a light bulb, but they didn't actually flip the switch to turn it off first and they get shocked and they're doing this video call with one of our maintenance people, where does that leave us, right? As much as we want to keep people separate, we also need to be thinking about those items as well. And then, of course, always the safety measures. Are we providing masks? Are we expecting people to provide their own masks? Are we changing our policies about cleaning and disinfecting? The other thing that I wanted to bring up is, are we changing things about meetings that we're having with people at the starts of their shifts? So if you think about whether it be facilities or custodial or maintenance people, oftentimes those people congregate in one place at the beginning of a shift to talk about what sort of work needs to be done. How are we going to do that safely? Are we going to meet outside and everybody stands 25 feet away from each other? What is that going to look like so that we can keep things moving forward, but do it in the safest way possible? Next slide. So this is going back to the COVID procedures that we're trying to talk about at the end of each of these topic areas to kind of give you an overview about how we're going to handle this stuff. So when you have a positive test, what are you going to do? So if you have a positive test in a housing space, are you going to take that housing space offline? Are you going to send people with positive tests to a separate housing space? What does that look like? Do you need to move people off campus? If you're moving people off campus, where are you moving them to? Are you moving them to a hotel? It's probably a great option because everybody has their own bathroom that way. Is that financially feasible? I don't know. That's something that each institution is going to have to think about for themselves. How are you going to staff that building? What employees are going to say, oh yeah, I'll work in the quarantine building? Probably not that many. How are you going to make that work? How can you get meals to those folks? If you're quarantining people and they can no longer go to the dining hall and you don't want like Uber Eats dropping something off for each person, you know, this goes to room 407, this goes to room 710. You don't want to have that happen. How are you going to get that stuff to those people? What are you going to do if a student needs to be transported? So you have people in a quarantine who are sick. If a student is sick to the point that they need to get to a hospital, who is in charge first of transporting them? And also who's in charge of determining when somebody needs to get to a hospital? I think that's a great question as well. And as Christina had mentioned before, do you need a new fire plan for that space? If you're moving people off campus to a new space, what does that do for your fire plan? Heck, what does that do for your clear reporting? Is that a whole new area that you're now going to have to report on? I don't know. You have to think about all of these things. And then, you know, stepping away from students for a minute, back to employees is, if you have a positive case among employees, how are you going to handle that? Do you inform their coworkers? Rob touched earlier on the sorts of information that you're allowed to supply without violating confidentiality and privacy. Do you inform the students whose rooms they might have been in? If I'm a maintenance worker and I did work in somebody's room and then I have a positive test the next day, are you telling those students that? What can you tell the media? What can you tell parents? And then we talked about contact tracing being a situation for the state, but you know, you've got to get that in place because, as we said before, you're going to have positive tests. So who do you call? Do you know exactly what your plan is on that point? Go ahead to the next slide. So we talked about academics, we talked about housing, and now we're going to move on to dining, and I'm going to kick it back to Christina for that.
Perfect. And we can go to the next slide. So with dining, just like housing, This is an area which is a high risk for contagion, right? Because you have a congregated amount of students traditionally or typically, but it is also one of those areas that students tend to feel as part of their experience. That said, I think this might, maybe a little more so than housing, have to just look different for right now. I don't think this will be a shock to many of your students given how dining has looked for them for the last few months. So let's go to the next slide. What you want to do is identify which dining options will remain open, how you're going to reconfigure those spaces, of course, working with the employees and the COVID procedures. Again, the similar breakdown. On the next slide, we go through the various dining options, right? Your traditional dining halls, coffee shops. You want to think about which ones you're actually going to allow to open, which ones you're not. One thing I also want to make sure you do think about is, will food pantries and other food aids be open to students that have some food insecurity? Not all schools have that, but some do. And then which of those spaces actually allows for the best social distancing? This is an area where you do really want to be very careful about the amount of social distancing that you allow, right? So what is the size of the space? What is the ventilation? If you have a line that forms outside, can you mark it in some way so that you allow for physical distancing? Directional flow could be very easy here, in one door, out the other, and just making sure, of course, it's accessible. When we reconfigure the space, which is the next slide, you want to think about one, how you're going to serve the food, right? We think about the traditional really crowded dining hall, right? With a million seats everywhere, books flying. That probably can't happen anymore. And you really want to think about, are we even going to allow sit down dining right now? Or are we just going to have people pick up meals and go? What I would be careful about, I know we're doing a lot of think about this, I would probably eliminate just buffet style right now, because I don't think that there is any way to make that completely safe. If you have the same, because you'd have to re-clean that utensil every time someone goes in and out. It's just not feasible in the world we're in right now. It probably does make sense to have a way of either pickup delivery service, or someone comes in, orders, waits in a spot, food is brought to them from a server. Again, it's a world we're living in right now, so I don't think it will be a complete shock. But if you are going to have any students there, really think about physically marking the floor space, so that people know how far 6 feet. I think we all think we do, but then it gets morphed as you get a lot of people into one area. So these are the types of things we're going to be thinking about in terms of reconfiguring the space, checking on allowable occupancy as well. If you have people coming in and out, once you hit that limit, no one else can go in until someone else comes out. That's another way to do it. You can get a lot of good tips here from how restaurants have been handling it in the wake of COVID right now. So then I'm going to turn it over to Carolyn to tack on the employee side of the house and some of the COVID procedures.
Thanks, Christina. Next slide, please. So again, the things that we want to be thinking about are, when we're opening the space, who is it that works in the space? So here you're going to have cooks, servers, probably not, unless you're having some sort of seated dining option, you know, at your the one fancy eating place that every university has on campus, I think, maybe has servers, dishwashers, cashiers, how are people paying for things, and then management employees to oversee all of these people. And then the safety things, you back to the usual. What are we doing? Masks? Are we doing deep cleaning? How frequently? Partitions between employees and students, particularly when you're paying, or even when you're just being handed food. Is there some sort of partition that you're putting in place? Is there adequate space between workstations, you know, particularly in a kitchen environment? You know, people are often on top of each other, bumping into each other. How are we going to keep those people separated? Limiting the use of cash. You know, at this point, I think we all know that money is dirty and it's only going to get dirtier. So do we want to be having cash change hands at all? Or do we want to go simply to some sort of, you know, the credit card or whatever people's student ID is linked to their food? I think those are the things that we need to be thinking about in that situation. Next, please. And then how do we ensure that these people are comfortable returning to work? training, training, training. We get those policies and procedures in place. We train people on them. These are the things that you have to follow. One of the things that I wanted to mention, particularly in this area, is a mechanism for bringing and addressing concerns. So I have seen some really great guidance about, do we set up a hotline that is just specifically for employees to talk about COVID issues? We want to make sure that we are dealing properly with those complaints, those concerns. Obviously, we want to avoid retaliation situations, but to the extent that we can get something really concrete in place for bringing those concerns up to the right people and getting them addressed, I think that is going to be very important right now. What other spaces besides their actual workspaces do we need to be thinking about? How are employees clocking in and clocking out? Is everyone using the same sort of terminal? Or are we wiping it down in between? What's happening with that? Break rooms where people congregate when they're on breaks. Are we going to have a set number of people that can come in and out of that room? Are we going to send people different places for breaks? What does that look like? And then as much as we talk about, dorm restrooms and restrooms in academic buildings, there are also these employee restrooms. And how frequently are those being cleaned? And how are we going to ensure that people feel comfortable opening the door, pushing that doorknob and getting into the restroom and then leaving it and having the next person come in? Those are all things that we have to be thinking about. So go to the next slide, please. Again, COVID procedures. What are we going to do after we have that positive test or those symptomatic people? Again, how are you going to handle food service for the people in quarantine? Are you going to have only on-campus deliveries? Who's going to make that delivery? Who's going to determine who has to tell the employee who's going to make that delivery? Do you have vendors who are willing to make deliveries to either that on-campus space or off-campus space, wherever it is that you're quarantining? And then what do we do with a dining employee who becomes sick? We send symptomatic employees home, of course, but do we inform their coworkers? Do we quarantine coworkers? When we quarantine coworkers, do we pay them? Those are good questions. Do we inform people who came in and out of the dining space at that point? And then we have here contact health department. I think that's a really great way to deal with these sorts of situations, particularly as they involve employees. Call your local health department. Say, this is my situation. What do I do? Those are the experts. Those are the people that you want to rely on to tell you what it exactly is that you need to do in these situations. And then the big question of, how do we bring back people who were previously sick? For employees, are you going to require a negative test? Can people even get tests at this point? Are they going to be able to get tests at a later point? How long is that quarantine period? Is a doctor's note saying that someone is no longer symptomatic going to be good enough? Again, all considerations when you're bringing people back when they have gone out either with symptoms or with a positive test. Go ahead to the next slide. So we've now moved on to international and travel, and I am going to kick it over to Catherine for that.
Great. Well, we've hit some of the really big campus-heavy issues: academics, dining, and housing. So we're going to move very quickly through these other considerations for you to think about that are also part of your campus experience. At the beginning of the pandemic, we focused a lot on international students and travel. Obviously, COVID-19 is not a foreign issue. It is here now. So what should go on your checklist as it relates to your international initiatives, whether it's recruiting and supporting international students or giving your students the opportunity to study abroad? So we just have some student concerns on the next slide here. Look at what the CDC says. Look at what the State Department says. Right now, the CDC and the State Department are still recommending anybody who travels internationally to self-isolate for 14 days. They are also still prohibiting entry into the country from foreign nationals, from non-US citizens or relatives of US citizens from quite a number of countries: China, Iran, the UK, Ireland, and the whole European Schengen area. So if you have students coming from these countries, they may not be able to come in right away unless the guidance changes. Or if they are allowed in, you may ask them to quarantine. Also, you'll want to follow guidance as it relates to student visa programs. The SEVP guidance is only updated as of March 13th, and it still states that if students are learning online or leave the country to take online classes, you have to notify ICE within 10 days. But there's also new, very current, as of Tuesday, frequently asked questions that elaborate a little bit more on this. And then looking over the right-hand column, obviously your student trips may be on hold, but how will you know whether and how to get them up and running? Same issues like with clinics and internships. So in terms of your interim policy or adjustments, make sure that these are voluntary and you revisit your legal documents as they apply to them. And then employees' concerns on the next slide, Carolyn will go through.
Yeah, just really quickly, I think these are fairly intuitive, but I think one of the questions that I'm getting asked is, can we tell our employees not to travel at all, even for personal travel? That's a great question. You can certainly tell them that they have to quarantine when they come back. Whether or not you can restrict personal travel is, you know, going to be, it's going to have a host of things that go with it, right? Particularly if you're a public employer versus a private employer, those are going to be very fact-specific questions that you're going to want to take a look at individually. And then, are you going to test people when they return from travel is another great question. Again, is testing going to be available? I think we're not really sure at this point, but that's going to have to evolve with changing circumstances as well. Next slide. So we went through a bunch. Again, we're coming to the end, which we want to leave some time for questions that everyone can ask, and we can hopefully provide you with some specific information that you're looking for. But we did want to touch quickly on extracurriculars and athletics, and I'm going to kick it over to Christina for that.
Right. So we said earlier that we talked about some of the biggest issues on campus, and we're sort of jumping through these other ones at the end. But man, isn't athletics and extracurriculars a huge part, and really could be its own segment as we are planning for the fall semester? I mean, one thing that just hangs in the loom of what will happen with sports on campus. I mean, the NCAA president basically just said that whether or not games will continue, or we will continue into the fall semester, really hinges on when and how schools return to campus life. And this is an important aspect because it impacts not only our students from an extracurricular way, it impacts financially all schools. It is an enrollment driver. It is a way to bring our alumni back for giving opportunities. And above and beyond our own institution, it impacts our communities. And so this is going to be a big driver. If we can go to the next slide. We don't have much right now, so that's why this can be a quick slide. The quick NCAA updates are in-person athletic recruiting is still suspended, and it is through the end of the month. Right now, unofficial or official visits are discouraged. They're not necessarily not permitted, but they are discouraged. What you should be doing though right now is before you return to campus, create a team. And you want to think about this sport by sport, not just the big ones I have up here on the slide, but think about all your sports and look at them from personal contact level, ball transfer, and equipment services. Then you have to go location by location. Where do those groups play and practice? You may not have control over all of those places, right? Some places they play may be a vendor contract. You also want to look at not only where they play, but what's their locker room, their meeting room, their training room, and really go through where it would be safe and how it would be safe for each sport individually. And then, and only then, do you get to the point of, okay, if we are going to bring this sport back, what pre-participation and continuing evaluation will we require, not only for our athletes, but for our coaches and medical staff as well? And then travel concerns, right? We have to monitor state, local, federal, and CDC because that's what our teams do. They go and they compete in other locations. There are two fantastic resources out there right now. I've given the links for both of them. NCAA put up some core principles. There's really nothing shocking in there, but the NETA's has a return to campus plan, and that has a really nice flow chart for you to think about this systematically, sport by sport. So if we could go to the next slide. On the employee safety piece, this is really right when you get to the point of which sports you want to bring back. Then you have to go to the, what does this mean? It's not just coaches, it's not just trainers, it is your ground staff, your custodial staff, your facility staff, administrative staff, everything that Carolyn has been saying sort of slide after slide. It's always bigger than you think. And then what kind of safety measures can you put in place, right? Some of these you really, maybe you could work from home, but a lot of these, they are in-person jobs. And so this is going to be a really hard one to think about. Maybe you could rotate shifts, how you're meeting, appointments only, all of the same things we've been thinking about. But that really gets to the point of once we've decided we're going to get started, what does that look like? If we can move to the next slide. I don't want to give short shrift. Athletics is a big thing, but of course, schools also have other extracurricular activities that support the student experience. We have rec halls, we have gyms, we have pools. Are any of these even safe to open right now? I mean, I think you really have to think about a lot of these. Pools right now, think about your community pool, probably not opening, right? Think about your gym and your rec center. That's a lot of cleaning for each of those units that people would be getting on, each of the machines, the free weights. You really want to think about the safety of, is that doable? And is there some other way that maybe we get people outside, we get a little more space, and we promote some activities that way? Beyond just physical activities, your other student organizations, they have meetings. Are you going to have conduct limitations with your RSOs on how they're allowed to meet, where they're allowed to meet, how many people can meet in person? And again, back to the housing pieces that I talked about, think about virtual ways to get people engaged and involved. People are probably a little zoomed out right now, but it is going to be the way to engage the student experience. And I'm sure your students will come up with many creative ways. And so work with some of your students to see if there's ways to engage the community in virtual environment. And then if we go to the next slide, obviously, if we open our rec center, we want to think about our custodial staff and not just the exercise instructors, right? And not just the people cleaning it, but the people that run the desk, that work the equipment. How do we keep them safe? How do we keep them comfortable? And that really is going to be a big component of whether or not you decide to open up some of those rec spaces. And there's really nothing we haven't talked about, and we've given you a checklist so you can look at this slide as we go through. And so I think the last touch point we're going to talk about today is student services. And so I'm going to turn over to Catherine for that to bring us home.
Great. All right, so let's go one more slide and we'll talk about student services. And the thing I want to say is that it can be done, like Christina said, creatively. Like with academics, you start to layer in virtual options that will let you toggle between a campus experience, a hybrid experience, and a fully virtual experience. Like you, I've been reading a lot about virtual learning, and one article that has stuck with me is, and I just want to point it to you so you can go back and look at it yourself, is one from The Atlantic on April 24th, and it's called, "What If Colleges Don't Open Until 2021?" And why this article sticks out for me is that it quotes Paul LeBlanc, who's the president of the University of Southern New Hampshire, which, as you may know, is almost entirely, if not actually entirely, excuse me, a virtual university. He said in this article, what's caught many universities off guard is whereas they could pivot somewhat quickly to do virtual teaching, they couldn't provide the accompanying student services. And many of these universities, which are mostly online, have figured out ways to do it, which indicates it can be done. So if you go to the next slide, I'm really just going to leave you with this checklist. Here's some things to think about. The health center, it is not online, but when it opens back up, how is it going to adjust to on-campus students, but also pivot if it needs to through telehealth? As it relates to telehealth, both in the terms of the health center, but also mental health services. As you may know, there are a lot of state regulations that apply to telecounseling and telehealth that you're going to have to review if you think you're going to have to pivot some way during the year. One thing, some states have passed emergency waivers, but who knows how that's going to end up. So you may want to consider, particularly in the area of mental health, establishing some sort of education in a group setting as opposed to creating that confidential therapeutic relationship. This may get you over some of those big hurdles, particularly you to pivot quickly. And then just think through all the other supports you provide to students: tutoring, career counseling, social support, and social both in terms of the social experience, like Christina was talking about, like an RA group. I've seen that some schools are considering pairing, especially new students, up with a virtual buddy, but also social experiences in terms, social support in terms of food insecurity. All these things are as much a part of your university as extracurriculars, academics, and housing. I didn't touch upon, but I'll just list them here quickly: your registrar, your admissions, bill payment. How are you going to make these accessible to students in an online environment? So with that, I'll turn it over.
With that, Catherine, we are at 2:30. For those of you who have a hard stop, we appreciate you sticking with us. We do not have a hard stop here. We're not being cut off. We will stick around for a couple more minutes. I want to give my panelists an opportunity to sort of give their best takeaways here. This is a shock to me. I think we have stunned everybody because it may be the fewest number of Q&As I've ever seen in a webinar on this issue. So it is just a lot of information. And I'm going to go back to just the idea that, you know, I know this is overwhelming. It is overwhelming just to sit here as watching all of this at one time and to see all this done. You are building a playbook, and you're building a playbook as a team, and you need to develop the process and the team. And when you break it down, as my panelists are trying to do here, it is in digestible and doable little blocks, but it's a whole university effort and not just the local council's office. So with that, we'll go through Christina, then Catherine and Carolyn. Any other takeaways? And we'll stay by to see if there's any other questions asked before we cut things off.
Sure. So my takeaways, there's two. The first one is this presentation was designed to give you a checklist. It's a lot of questions, but sometimes we have so many questions rattling around in our brain that it's nice to have it in one spot that you can use to talk to your colleagues in a meaningful way and walk away with some form of a plan. And my second takeaway is to start small. Pick one area and get started, and really go through these questions. You want to tackle everything at once, and you will, but start small, see if it's doable on that platform, and then expand. I think that will help everyone feel as though there is some control in an uncontrollable environment. So I will turn over to Carolyn.
Yeah, so I think that my biggest takeaway is have a plan. You know, whether it be the big plan, each individual plan as it relates to these discrete areas, whatever you do, you're not going to be able to move forward without a plan. You're going to feel paralyzed. And once you get that plan in place, that's when you're going to be able to appropriately divvy things up to the right people to be answering each question. You know, I want to speak specifically to the general counsel that are on the phone. We know you want to answer every question, and we know that you are capable of answering so many questions, but that's just not feasible in this situation. You've got to get your team together. You've got to put that plan in place, and people have to support each other at this time.
Catherine?
I don't have much more to add. I think the thing I take away, and when preparing for this, that was really important to me to think about, was the flexibility and maintaining the ability to pivot in light of situations that you can't control, whether it's a government order to go back onto some sort of lockdown. So to have all scenarios in mind and to keep flexibility, we got caught off guard this spring. So we can make sure, as you said, Rob, this is not unforeseen, that at least we have that ability to be flexible.
Okay. Before anybody else leaves, I will say that yes, this is being recorded. Yes, the slides will be available, and our marketing department will send out information. I don't know if it'll be today or in the next day or two about accessing that information for all of you. We have one question that came in. Any advice on student research programs that have been funded through grants but can't occur due to laboratories being closed? Talk to the grantor agency. Every agency that I've dealt with is doing huge extensions and huge adaptations because it's a whole new world, and everything's being negotiated on the fly. I will simply add that I know that a lot of you are thinking after all of this, to answer Christina's first question, are we prepared to be open? Are we ready to be open? And what does opening even mean? And these kinds of questions and issues have driven a number of schools to already decide the answer is no, we're going to stay virtual for the fall. But whatever you decide for what's going to happen in August, you're probably going to be asking the same situations with a little bit more knowledge and a little bit more preparation in December. So this is going to be an adaptive, longer term than any of us want to think process. So yeah, so I hope this was helpful. Let's see, is there anything else here in the chat box? Nope, that is it right now. If there are no further questions, I want to thank everybody who attended and thank our 3 panelists here and thank our marketing department for putting this together on short notice. Hey, good luck and be safe out there.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks.